So if you need a refresher, or if for some reason you can't join me someday, they're usually up within a couple hours after the class. If you just look under conferences and scroll down, you'll see the list of recordings. But here's the thing I want to share, and I'll put it in the dashboard. When I put stuff in the dashboard, does it send you guys an email through Populi? Okay, that's wonderful. It's such a great way for me to communicate with you all. And if you need to get in touch with me, just send me an email. It comes right to my phone, and I'm pretty good about responding fairly quickly. Usually within a day max, but often much quicker than that. All right, so we had our first diversity and inclusion committee meeting, and that's an interesting thing. Maybe we could take just a couple minutes to talk about that. And I'm not wanting this to be overly political, although there certainly are political elements to it. But just this week, the president did a federal-wide memo ending all diversity and inclusion training. And the rationale behind this, and this is for federal employees. So if you work for the post office or the State Department, or I'm assuming Border Patrol or something like that, where maybe a little diversity inclusion training could go a long ways. But part of why they stopped the funding was this idea that Black Lives Matter is critical race theory, and it's like a version of Marxism, and it's anti-American, and we're not going to pay taxpayer money to indoctrinate federal employees on diversity and inclusion. So I just want to know if anyone had any thoughts about that. As you can imagine, I have a lot of thoughts about it, being chair of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee, which we are unaffected because we're not federally funded, or we're not a federal organization. So as far as I know, the school is going to continue with our diversity and inclusion committee. But any thoughts or comments on that?
So what do you guys actually do on that committee?
In the past, we used to just highlight different cultures and ethnic groups. And so we'd have like kind of international film festival nights where we'd pick a movie like by Miyazaki or Kurosawa, or from Southern, Franco Zeffirelli, I mean, Italian movies, Asian movies, just trying to give the students a sampler of different cultures. And then we'd usually have a speaker come in from that culture, and we'd have food, stories, just kind of a informative exposure. But then as our school began to become more diverse, in fact, for the last 3 years, we have not had a majority ethnicity. And what I mean by that is no ethnic group has been over 50% on our campus the last 3 years. And I believe this year we have an equal amount of Hispanic students and white non-Hispanic students. At least that's the way in the demographic breakdowns they have it. The remain, and I think those are both at around 43%, and then the remaining percentages, I think we have about 7% African Americans, a couple percent Asian, and then some Native Americans is kind of rounds out that mix. So WASC, our accreditors, wanted us to kind of get out ahead of it to avoid any potential problems, because we weren't just kind of like a monocultural campus anymore, but we had all these different elements. So we've been working really hard by having like community town halls, and I'd like to have another one. Maybe we can have a virtual one even this month, where we invite the students to talk about their experiences here on campus, if they feel welcome, if they feel like it's their school, or if they feel like they're always an outsider, always like a visiting guest. And we certainly want to be aware if there are any racial issues, whether that's discrimination, slurs, just unacceptable, inappropriate behavior in our society at large, but especially for a Christian college and Christian community. And so what we've been trying to work with is to be available if people do have grievances or problems. For the most part, what I've gleaned from our town hall meeting so far is even though there is some racist stuff at our school, for the most part, people felt it wasn't necessarily intentional or belligerent, but it was more out of ignorance. Like people just didn't know better about how offensive what they were saying or asking was. And that makes me feel better, because if that's the problem, we can fix it through education, right? But if it's a heart issue, I mean, that's going to need a change of heart, a change of conversion of how you look at others and the world. And so we're working at it on both fronts. We're trying to educate people, and that will include faculty. Yes, I know some of our faculty need help. I'm learning new stuff every day myself. Staff, they definitely need to understand. And then for students. But the tension I'm dealing with is, I know when you try to force this kind of training on people, you can get like a backlash or resistance. So I'm really trying to get a buy-in from the school at large to see the value. And I get the critiques about critical race theory. If you don't know about critical race theory, it's like a modern form of Marxism. And basically, it's asking questions like, who benefits from the way things are? Follow the money. Who's making money from the way society is set up? And so a lot of Black Lives Matter apologists are actual critical race theories, but not all, right? There's the sentiment of Black Lives Matter, which I would hope everyone could agree on, but then there's a loose associations of semi-autonomous groups called Black Lives Matter that are part of this critical race theory or this Marxism light. What I would say about them is I think their critiques are profound. It's just I disagree with their solution because I'm not a Marxist, I'm a Christian. And Marxism is dialectical materialism, which means they only believe in the physical material world. So they're looking for physical material solutions to the problems of human beings, like the race issues. So they want to challenge Western and Christian presuppositions, like the nuclear family, capitalism, these sorts of things. What I like is their critique. I think they're spot on of who's benefiting the way America is right now. But I think I have a Christian solution, and that is a conversion of heart. And I believe that's what will allow us to see each other as brothers and sisters and equals. So anyways, that's what all that's about. Did I answer your question? Was that David?
Yes, sir. I think so.
Okay.
So,
Another thing we're doing is we're tracking, with Popoly now we have the ability to track different ethnic groups. And I'm specifically looking at minority groups, which is everyone now, but specifically people of color, African Americans, Hispanic, and especially first generation college students. Because if you came from a family where you're one or both of your parents are college graduates, you already have someone that can kind of help you navigate, you know, when to get in your applications, how to apply for grants, how to go through the process, how to time management, because your parent or someone in your family has gone through the process. But if this is your first time through, you may not have any resources or even have a clue how to navigate this world of academia. And so we're really trying to focus on those first generation college students to provide them the resources and support that they need to be successful and to graduate. So that's the other main thing I'm doing this semester. All right, well, I thought there'd be more comments on that, but maybe it's just me that gets spun up by things like this. Okay. The other thing I wanted to talk about was when we were having this diversity inclusion meeting, it turns out they are still going to have the multicultural fair. And so make sure you put this date on your calendar because I want to do a change up in the syllabus, which I think you'll all be happy with.
Sorry, we got kind of distracted because we're at the school and there's like ash like kind of like raining down over us.
Oh, is it really?
Yeah, there's like a fire close.
No, that's not good.
Yeah.
I think they're getting a handle on that valley fire, but they've still got a ways to go. Okay, so I have written down here Monday, November 16th, 10 to 11. will be the multicultural fair. And that's where we're going to have booths and highlight different cultures and subcultures in the community. And so because of the COVID thing.
Hey, Professor, sorry, you cut out on me. What was that date again?
It's November 16th.
November 16th.
10 to 11. And I'm assuming they'll do the booths outside in the parking lot. So we have more space and we can practice our social distancing and all that. November's a ways off, but there's no way to say how the COVID's going to affect us by that time. So anyways, instead of doing the field work, which would be really hard with the COVID, going into a different ethnic community that didn't know you and trying to have a role and relationship, I still want you to do the 10-page paper as a group, but instead of having to go out into the community in these other groups, I'm going to ask you to do more maybe like online research or communicating through emails or FaceTime or things like that with different people. And then your group will sponsor a booth and you'll highlight your culture and that will count as your presentation for the class. So you won't have to get up or do a Zoom presentation for the class. We'll count your booth for that. And then you'll collectively turn in a paper on the culture you decided to highlight. And like I said, I'm looking for groups with this size class, maybe 5 groups of 4 to 5 people. And so if you have friends in the class or people that have similar interests or want to study a culture together, you can make up your groups on your own. When we get to the midterm, probably one of the last questions on the test I'll ask, have you formed a group yet? What do you want to study? And then the people that don't have a group, I'll sort them into groups depending on how many people are remaining.
So the cultural or the cultural assignment that we have, the main one, is after the midterm?
Yes.
Okay, so we don't have to do anything for that until after. Got it.
Right. So don't even worry about it yet. Chapter 5 is going to be talking about field work, and there I'll give you guidelines of what I'm looking for on your booth and your paper. And I'll also put a file guidelines up so you can look at those. And it will be like a formal research paper. So I want the whole thing, the title page, and then everyone's name on your group will go on that title page. So you're going to get a collective grade on the paper and the booth. And I know a lot of you hate that, but it's life. I have to work with groups all the time. And so it's another good learning skill set. And like I said, if someone in your group isn't helping or pulling their weight, confront them first individually, then as a group. And if you can't get a response, bring me into it and I will help encourage them mightily. Okay. Is that good for the business part? Okay. So chapter 4. And this chapter is going to deal with the development of anthropological thought. And this is one of the newest academic disciplines we have, even though people as far back as Herodotus or Aristotle were certainly keen observers of humans and human nature, human cultures. In the 19th century, change in Western worldviews from supernaturalism began to occur to naturalism. And in our last discussion board, I asked you to point out the perspective the book was coming from, and you guys did a really good job. I mean, some of you said secular humanist, some of you said natural materialist, some of you said evolutionist, and those are all correct. And that's part of what the book is referring to. During the medieval period, from like the 5th to the 15th century AD, Christianity dominated culture and academia, even philosophy. All the philosophers were also theologians. But when we get to the 16th century, after the Renaissance, we enter the period called the Age of Reason or the Age of Enlightenment. The medieval period was called the Age of Faith. And so people now went from thinking in theistic terms. So like if the COVID happened in the medieval period, people would assume it was either God's punishment on them or the work of the devil. Everything had a spiritual underlying form. They weren't thinking of it in scientific materialistic terms. Now our society is so flipped that it's almost all we talk about is the physical aspects of COVID. We don't talk about, is there a spiritual cause? Are there spiritual ramifications? Even in Christian circles, I hear them talking mostly in materialistic terms about COVID. But that's a worldview shift where we went from a theistic view that there is a physical material world, but also a spiritual world, and that spiritual world permeates the physical material, to now a world that it's just the physical material. And our book and a lot of these theories are going to reflect that shift in perspective. Okay. If you guys ever have questions or anything, just speak up. Your little box will light up if you turn your mic on, so I'll know who's talking to me. Okay, first guy out of the chute is James Hutton, 1795, James Hutton. And he introduced the theories of gradualism, and these are contrasted with catastrophism. And gradualism states that things have changed in a gradual, consistent way, almost like a ramp, a slow, gradual change from simple to complex over a long period of time. Okay, so that's this idea of gradualism. Catastrophism is this idea that, well, things may be the same for a while, but then we might have cyclones, and then we might have periods of global warming, and then we might have ice ages, worldwide floods, asteroids hitting the planets. So instead of a nice gradual slope, we get this jagged, almost like a heart monitor look of catastrophism. So those were two competing theories of looking at the world and cultures. Charles Lyle, 1830, he came up with this theory of uniformitarianism. And this is going to be really important because this is one of the key presuppositions of Darwinian evolution. And as you can see, both of these guys predate Darwin. So Darwin's theories didn't just happen in a vacuum. It was part of the culture and the intellectual thinking of his day. Gradualism and now uniformitarianism. And uniformitarianism states that things are happening today like they happened yesterday, like they happened 10 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 1,000,000 years ago. And the reason this is important is this is the foundation for almost all scientific dating techniques. We start with the assumption that there is a regular rate of decay of either carbon or radium or argon or different chemicals. And when we can look at how much is left in an object, we base it off the presupposition of how much should have been there at the beginning. And when we look at the half-life rates of decay, like of carbon-14, we can get estimates of how old we think things are. But once again, it's based on the presupposition that things happening today are like they happened in the past. So it's definitely following the gradualism model. Any questions or comments on that? Let me give one more example just because it's important. I believe the estimates of how long it took the Colorado River to carve out the Grand Canyon range anywhere from 7 to 30 million years. And if someone wants to Google that for me, so I'm not just making up my own numbers, I'd be curious what you get. But the way they get those dates is if you can measure the flow of the Colorado River and how much sediment it's removing in an hour, you simply times that by 24 and then times that by 365, and that will tell you how much sediment the Colorado River is removing from that plateau in a year. And then if you can calculate how much mass has been removed from that mile-deep canyon, and you divide that into the number, it will tell you how many years it took that river to carve out that much sediment. So it's very logical, but I just want to point out the presupposition. It's presupposing the Colorado River is flowing today like it was yesterday, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 1,000,000 years ago. And that's a huge presupposition, in my opinion. Did someone get a date for how old the Grand Canyon is?
It said from like 5 to 6 million.
Okay, so more on the low end of what I said. So thank you, 5 to 6 million. But that's how they're getting that date. Does that make sense to you guys? It's just a calculation based on this uniformitarian presupposition. And I'm not saying that's a bad guess or a bad way to do it. I just want to point out that part of science, it's being inferred, it's not being observed, because no one has been around for 5 to 6 million years to watch that river carve out that canyon. So we have to use inferences, and inferences involve presuppositions. Does that make sense? I get into this big time in philosophy of origins, but I think that's enough for what we're doing. Okay.
The name of the first person one more time. Sorry about that.
The first person was James Hutton, and he was the gradualism guy. And then Charles Lyle came up with uniformitarianism.
And are those dates important? Because I missed the first date as well.
I'm not going to be that picky. It's going to be kind of like the vocab, where I'll list names or theories, and then I'll have definitions or significant contributions they did, and you'll have to match them. So I want you to know them well enough to recognize those names with the ideas. Okay?
I think it's
Sounds good.
how just like were you gonna say something, Rhea?
No, you're good.
I was gonna say how like as mankind, like we fill in the gaps ourselves and then present them as like absolutes. And it just like shows you like the deepness of our desire to like know, like have answers, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, we are curious. We crave to know. I think that's part of being human. Okay. Then what ends up happening is with Charles Darwin, he publishes The Origin of Species in 1859. And evolution is not a new concept. It goes all the way back to the 5th, 6th century BC with the Greeks that I'm aware of. And they had this idea of evolution, or things changing, going from simple to complex, or from one form to another. What was unique about Darwin's approach was his mechanism for evolution was purely materialistic, and it's called natural selection. And his idea was that due to environmental factors, certain traits would be more desirable or would help someone survive and be able to breed and replicate. Other traits would not be so helpful. And so those members of the species would probably die off, not get to pass off their genes, and so you get genetic drift. And Darwin went so far to believe that all life started as a single cell, and from that single cell, we get all the variations we see today. Now, his theory started as kind of like a ladder approach, from single cell going up to like multi-celled organisms, fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, all the way up to the primates and then humans. So you get kind of like this ladder approach of evolution. But now evolution is much more like a tree, right? The tree of life, where you have different branches going off, and with each one you get diverse speciation. And these changes occur through mutation. So if you've ever had a litter of puppies or kittens, there's a range, right? There's usually a runt, and there's usually one bigger than the others. Some might have short fur, some might have long fur, some might be white, others might be multicolored. And the idea with natural selection is, let's take the Arctic hare, for example. Arctic hares have adapted over time to having white color fur for camouflage, because they're living in a snowy environment. They have really short ears to save body heat, and there's fur on the bottom of their feet for insulation against the snow and ice. Now, it's still a hare. You could breed it with a jackrabbit, and I believe they could produce viable offspring. But a jackrabbit has adapted to a very different environment. It is also a hare, but it lives in the deserts. And so its ears are huge because its ears are actually working like a radiator or a cooler, and its skin is brown, so it blends in with its desert environment, and it has really long legs and rapid speed by which to avoid predators. And so even though these are both hares, the different environments through natural selection has chosen certain traits that aid in survival, and the ones that don't have those traits, they're not making babies, so they're not passing on their genes. Was that a clear enough, quick explanation of natural selection? Okay, through mutation? Good. And once again, this is an incredibly logical, rational theory based on observation. And I don't even know of any creationists, even young Earth creationists, that disagree with adaptation through mutation. I don't think that's what's in dispute here. What's in dispute is like one kind or one species changing into another kind or species. That's where the debate's happening, not that mutation's taking place and that adaptation is taking place. So Darwin is pitching this naturalistic view where we no longer need a god or something supernatural, but everything is coming through simply the choices of nature. And part of how he came to this in the 19th century, for these intellectual scholar gentlemen, a lot of them raised pigeons, and they would breed pigeons. I mean, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of varieties of pigeons. There, you know, there's tumblers, there's homing pigeons, there's pigeons for eating, there's pigeons for eggs, there's messenger pigeons. It's just all these different types of fancy breeds of pigeons that these scholar intellects would do as like a hobby. And Darwin began to speculate, if we could get this kind of variety in just a couple hundred years through purposeful selection, what could nature do if given vast amounts of time? And that's how he like worked backwards to, we all could have come from the same source given enough time and enough mutation. Okay. We also at this time period start to get some theists or Christians trying to reconcile Darwinian evolution with the Holy Scriptures. And this is where we get things like theistic evolution, where there's a belief in a God, but God has used evolution as his means to bring about the diversity of creatures in the world today. And that's actually probably the majority position among at least scholars in even evangelical circles. Now, that doesn't mean it's right or true. I think among the laity and most people, they would still believe in perhaps a literal 6-day creation, but that is becoming more and more of a fringe view as we move into the 21st century. Any comments or questions on that? And once again, I'm not saying it's not a true view. I'm just want you to be aware, if you were brought up in a young earth school or church or family, that's definitely seen as an out there view now. When I went to San Diego State, I asked some of my professors about it, and they were trying to be polite, but I could tell they were looking at me like I was some sort of flat earther or something. And I was like, oh dear, but I get it. And for that very reason is part of why I've been studying flat earth. Have you seen there's like a revivalist flat earth movement going on? They just had, I think, their second national conference in Denver this year. And these people are for real. They are not messing around. They really believe the earth is flat and that we're not moving, but it's actually the sun, moon, and stars that are actually moving around us. It's like we're a big flat dinner plate, and you have the heavens, almost like if you've seen those like glass domes you put over a cake to keep the flies and stuff off of it. That's how they view the sun, moon, and stars are in this watery canopy above us, and that's what's turning and spinning, giving us the seasons and constellations night and day, but we're standing still on a flat earth at the center of the universe. Yeah, David?
So have they never actually gotten in an aircraft and flew above the earth?
Well, but see, even in an aircraft, you can't see the curvature of the Earth. Unless, I believe you have to be at 60,000 feet to begin to see the curvature. And we could double check that too. That would be easy to search. But they're also conspiracy theorists, right? So any sort of NASA or space or satellite photos, they just chalk off as
Fake.
that's the government trying to keep us deceived and blinded and all that good stuff.
But even then, though, it's, I mean, even at 14,000 feet, I mean, you can kind of see a curvature a little bit. I mean, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, but it's just a distortion. You're not actually seeing it that low.
Well,
I mean, I feel the same way, David. I've been on mountain peaks and stuff, and I'm like, oh, wow, look at the curvature. But no, if you do the research, you can't see it from that low in elevation.
I know with like fisheye cameras, you can see it more, but then again, it's just
Sure, but that's the lens distorting the view.
yeah.
It's like I've seen people take pictures from the top of Everest with the fisheye lens, and it just looks like you can see the whole curvature of the Earth. But that's just the lens. That's not what you're seeing from the top of Everest.
But even then, though, it's like it doesn't make any sense to me, because if it was a flat Earth, it'd be like a table, and once you get to the end, you just fall off.
Well,
So
that's because there's an ice wall, David, at the end, 100-foot ice wall that surrounds the flat plate. And that's Antarctica. And if you've seen pictures of Antarctica from the sea, it's like this 100-foot wall of ice just going up. And if you sailed around it, see, from a globalist perspective, you'd be sailing around Antarctica. From a flat Earth perspective, Antarctica is actually ringing the plate. Does that make sense? Yeah, it's frightening. I know their arguments, but part of why I wanted to learn their arguments is because I did see the parallels between that and young Earth creationism, which both theories fly in the face of modern science. And when you find devotees, if you give them their presuppositions, it's very difficult to argue against a flat Earth, just from what you can observe from ground level. The only arguments I've got so far that seem to work would be even with a pair of binoculars, you can look at the moon and you can see craters on the moon, because most of these flat earthers are getting this from the Bible. I mean, I thought I took the Bible literally historically. These people make me look like an allegorist, because if the Bible says a greater light to rule the day and a lesser light to rule the night, they actually believe the moon is generating its own light. It's not reflecting the light of the sun. It's its own light source. But if that was true, the shadows should not be in the craters of the moon if the light was coming out of the moon. But if it's being hit by the sun, you're going to be having sun cast shadows on the moon. So that's one thing you can point out to a flat earther.
Which, if the moon was its own light, I think that was just a mistranslation of the Bible.
Well, it's not a mistranslation. It could just be a figure of speech.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Yeah. Well, right. And there's other things too, like it talks about the four corners of the earth, or it talks about the pillars of the earth. These people actually believe it's a square with like a circular plate in the middle, and then you have pillars, like think Greco-Roman pillars holding it up. Now, what the pillars are on, I guess they're on top of the elephants, right? That are on top of the turtle that is flying through space or whatever. But it's just amazing to me that this is actually a revivalist theory. And I'm not even sure why I'm talking about this, but I think it's fun. So onward.
No, I used to have I knew a guy that was a flat earther, and he seemed crazy. Even when
Imagine how a young Earth creationist would sound to someone who believes the universe is over 13 billion years old and the Earth itself is over 4 billion. And here you have young Earth creationists claiming it's more like 6,000 to 10,000 years old. I mean, that's not even close, right? We're not even talking about the same scenario. And so I guess that's why I was bringing it up. I just want you to be aware how people in the scientific community are going to view young Earth creationism. They're just going to see it as pseudoscience and kind of like wackadoodle medieval leftover stuff.
I think with the time, I think that's just the 6,000 years is God's time, not our time. That's how I view it, at least. Because we don't know how God views time. I mean, 1,000 years for him could be, 50 million years for us.
Possibly. I mean, we do have the scripture that says a day with the Lord is as 1,000 years, but in the Genesis account, we also have a description, the evening and the morning were the first day. And that's still how we measure days today, right? That's one rotation of the earth.
Right.
And a year is one revolution around the sun. So that's how we do time, all the way back to like this Genesis account. And think of how it's even affected our culture, right? With our 7-day week. I mean, that all goes back to that Genesis creation account, at least in the West. It's had such a huge impact on the West. All right, let me keep going. When Darwinian evolution was applied to the study of anthropology, you can kind of logically infer what the conclusions are going to be. So firstly, we have primitive races are evolving towards a civilized state. And so it's not just biology, like single-celled to human beings in the tree of life, but even races can be ranked from almost animals to being fully civilized human beings. And some of these theories are going to have grades of development. And that's how they're going to evaluate different cultures, looking at where they think they fall in this spectrum. And it's that gradualism again, going from very primitive savagery all the way up to civilized, domesticated. Now, it's so interesting because the Bible has a completely inverted view of humanity. In the biblical account, humans are made perfect, complete. And so I would assume that's in body, soul, mind. They were like the prime first specimens of the species from which all other humans came. Yet in the naturalistic materialist view, we started as proto-humans, and then over time, we evolved better each and every day in each and every way until we're the magnificent species we see in the beginning of the 21st century. But people who lived earlier than us would have been less evolved than us. So in the biblical view, we started high, and then because of sin, there was a breakdown, not just in our minds and our intelligence, but even in our physiology, in our genetic code. And so there's a breakdown. In the Darwinian view, you start simple and evolve to complex. So very different views. Okay, onward.
Does that mean that like people who believe in evolution think that there's so primitive, like quote unquote, like races out there?
Oh yes, very much so.
So like, how do they define and decide who's primitive and who's not?
Thank you for the question, and it's a great lead in to our first theory, and this is called unilineal evolution. So UNILINEAL, UNILINEAL, unilineal evolution. And what this theory states is all humans' ways of life pass through similar stages of development. And in this theory, the belief is that humans start as savages, and then we evolve to barbarians, and then from barbarians to civilized human beings. And part of how we would determine where people are on that spectrum would have to do with technology, tool use, written language. These would be things that would separate the savages from the civilized. In the same way, it's not just cultures or people that are evolving, but even religion itself. So, for example, if you look at the earliest religions we know of in the world, they would fall under the category of animism. And animism is the belief that virtually everything is alive or has a spirit. And I say virtually because some things are dead. But then these animistic cultures over time began to elevate certain spirits into like a divine category. And so from animism, we get polytheism, many gods. And so now, instead of dealing with every spirit of the forest and the lake, let's use the example, say you're an ancient Greek and you're wanting to sail across the Mediterranean. Well, you might have to give a supplication or an offering to the waves, to the wind, to the sharks, to the whales, to the squids, to all the sea creatures and minions and beasties. But if you elevate a spirit like Poseidon or Neptune as God or Lord of the oceans, if you become a devotee or offer a sacrifice to that deity, he will keep all the minions in check for you. So it saves a lot of time being a polytheist from being an animist, because the animist is having to deal with all the spirits. The polytheist has selected certain spirits as kind of like these overarching controllers, like domains. And you just need to check in with the big guys and they'll take care of all the little minion spirits. This then evolves from polytheism to monotheism or pantheism, this belief in one God or that all is one. And even in this, if you look at the Bible, we get this progressive revelation. God in Genesis is presented as this primordial creator spirit. And then we see him in Egypt claiming he is the greatest of all the gods. So we go from almost like an animistic description to a polytheistic. And much of the Old Testament is God in competition with or showing his superiority to the gods of the other nations. And then by the time we get to Isaiah and the major prophets, it's quite clear that these other gods aren't even real, but there is only one God. And then we have even the progression going through from the Exodus. We have this primordial God in combat with other gods, like unleashing the 10 plagues on Egypt. But then we have a God of law, like with the 10 Commandments. And then we have a God who's represented as the king of the universe. And then we have a God who's represented as a man, as the suffering servant. And then eventually in secular humanism, we get to the place where we realize man is God. We are the end all. We are the end projection of creation. We get to decide what is the good, the true, and beautiful because we're the most evolved form of life on the planet or in the cosmos as far as we know. So that's applying evolution to anthropology or the study of religion. Isn't that interesting? So you could apply those presuppositions of gradualism or uniformitarianism or even evolution from simple to complex to everything, from fashion to religion to politics. It's all in there. It's not just for biology. Okay, next. We also end up having two schools of thought. One is called Comparativism, where you look at different cultures and look for their similarity and their differences. We'll be doing some of that in the class. And then also the holistic approach, where you realize you can't just compare like their religion or their food or their technology, but you also have to look at their ideas, their values, their beliefs. So a holistic approach is bringing both the non-tangible, like the soft data, with the hard data, the physical material parts of the culture, with the ideals, values, and beliefs of the culture. So that's the holistic approach. Comparative is kind of like this compare-contrast approach with cultures with each other. There was faith that the scientific method would uncover natural laws. And we have our first anthropology course in 1879 in Rochester, New York. So that's really late when you think of other disciplines like science, chemistry, mathematics, music, philosophy. 1879 is our first anthropology course in Rochester, New York. And the first anthropology department was in 1886 at the University of Pennsylvania. So both of these happening in the latter part of the 19th century. Now, from the 1900s to the 1940s, America had its own unique theory on anthropology, and this was called historical particularism. Historical particularism. And what this theory states is each culture has its own unique historical past that shapes it. Each culture is unique and must be judged within its own context. So for us to judge, like say an Inuit or Arctic culture based on, oh, they have no metallurgy, they don't have a wheel, all they have is like bone tools, and they're using dogs for transportation, and they're basically fishermen, hunter gatherers, and that's their life. It's not fair, according to a historical particularist, to take some industrialized European culture and then compare the two technologies and say, oh, you're inferior, you're barbaric, or you're savage because you don't have these tools, you haven't developed the wheel, you haven't developed a written language. And basically what the historical particularist would say is these people are incredibly sophisticated and have appropriate technology for the environment in which they live and their historical background that brought them to this place in time. And how many of us could live for 24 hours if we were dropped off in the Arctic? I couldn't. I mean, I don't have the skill set to provide shelter or food or safety for myself in that environment. And so, but someone born and raised in that environment would know how to survive, and they would have the technology and skills to do so. You could say the same for a jungle people, same for a desert people. We have all developed different tools and techniques to survive in the environments in which we live. And that's what the historical particularist is saying. If you want to understand a culture, you have to understand it in its own light, in its own historical context. You can't just be randomly comparing selected aspects of it with other cultures and get an accurate understanding.
So
Okay,
would you think that unilineal evolutionists are more like comparatives?
Yes, that's good, yes. Okay, onward. Franz Boas in the 1900s and his famous disciple student Margaret Mead. And they argued against ethnocentrism. Boas, and remember, ethnocentrism is like racism, except you're using your ethnicity or your learned cultural behavior to evaluate and judge others instead of the pigment of their skin. Okay, so he opposes ethnocentrism, and he claimed evolutionists made up progressive stages of development rather than objectively observing them. He advocated for field work rather than armchair theorizing. A relativistic approach requires a suspended sense of judgment, which allows for more objectivity. Try to eliminate presuppositions and prejudice. So what was happening in England and Europe with the early anthropology departments was people would come up with these ingenious ideas about how humans were, where they came from, why different people were at different stages of development. And then they would go out in the world and look for tribal or indigenous groups that would match their presuppositions that they came up in their offices at Oxford or wherever. And Franz Boas is saying, no, that is not how you do science. You don't start with the conclusions, you start with observation. So he's the one that really pushed for this idea of field work. First, you have to go out and study different people groups, live with them, learn their language, learn their beliefs, eat their food, do their dances, participate in their customs, then come back to your office and come up with theories of why they behave the way they do. So he's trying to bring the scientific method of observation into the realm, because anthropology is what's considered a social science, where we're actually using scientific techniques and methods, but we're studying human beings, human culture, human society. Questions on that? Part of why Margaret Mead, his student, was so famous was she was one of the first people to go out and do field work. So if you can imagine this woman in like turn of the century dress, it's like the Victorian era, I'm assuming, and she's there in Tahiti in her long dress, her lace, Victorian lace collars, her big hat, her white gloves, but she's living in huts with these bare-chested island women, eating their food, learning their language, learning about their hopes, dreams, and fears, and then writing about them. And I don't know that people had done that before, at least not intentionally, systematically. And so she was really trying to observe, to check her own biases and presuppositions, and to, as objectively as possible, write about the people she was studying. Now, by our 21st century standards and sensibilities, we'd probably be quite horrified by some of Margaret Mead's observations and techniques. And there have been a lot of critiques about her and her own bias and prejudice and Eurocentrism. But I mean, she was an early pioneer in this type of fieldwork exploration. Questions on any of that? Both Franz Boas and Margaret Mead strongly argued against biological determinism, and they embraced this idea of cultural relativism. And we mentioned that, I think, 2-3 classes ago. Remember, cultural relativism is descriptive. It's simply observing different cultures and how they behave differently in different times and different places. Later, when people saw all these cultural relativism reports and ethnographies, and that's the writings about these culture groups, ethicists came up with ethical relativism, which says, when in Papua New Guinea, do as the Papua New Guineans. When in Southern California, do as the Southern Californians. When in Rome, do as the Romans. And so that's prescriptive. It's telling you how you ought to behave. Cultural relativism, and the way the authors have tried to write the book, is simply descriptive. They're not going to tell you, oh, this is a high culture, this is a low culture. These people are advanced, these people are primitive. They're not going to be doing any of that. At least I don't recall seeing that in the book. What they're going to do is just describe different people groups and the way they are and leave it at that. They're not going to say that's good or bad. And they're just going to tell you how it is and leave the value judgments to the readers. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah, we're doing good. 15 more minutes. The next group arose in the 20s through the 50s, 1920s through 1950s, and these were the British functionalists. And functionalism states that societies can be explained in terms of the functions they performed, how ideas and actions contribute to the well-being and preservation of the culture. And that's part of what I was alluding to in Baraka when we talked about the chicks and how they kept going from the chicks being sorted to the humans going through the subway turnstiles. And there was like a connection between our view of food and our view of people. And others would look at technology. They would say your tool use or your technology is going to tell us how evolved or how advanced your culture is. And so cultures are based on the functions they perform. And each culture is going to have kind of like its own temperament or specialization or stereotype that we would put with them. So let's do a quick stereotype survey. I'm more familiar with like European stereotypes, but we live on the Pacific Rim, so we also have Asian stereotypes as well. So what would be some stereotypes we have as cultures? And I'm asking this from a British functionalist perspective. Let me prime the pump a little. Part of our stereotypes about Germans is that they are very sophisticated and have advanced engineering. And so there is a premium on German, especially automobiles, because just the precision and performance of brands like BMW, Mercedes, I mean, they have earned a reputation in the world. But when we think of Italians, even though Italians make some of the finest cars in the world, right? That's usually not what Italians are known for. What would we think more in terms of Italian cultural accomplishments?
Pasta.
Yes, food, cuisine. Same with the French, right? We're not thinking so much of the French as brilliant scientists or mathematicians or engineers, but we certainly would respect them as artists, as chefs, in those realms. And I just think that's super interesting when you start thinking about cultures in those terms of what they do, what they excel at, and then maybe where they're found a little wanting. Okay. And that kind of ties back into that whole geographical determinism thing, where you tend to find more northerly climes, the people are more industrious in that sense of like engineering, productivity, industry. But as you get further to the south, closer to the equator, it seems like they're more romantic, more given to poetry, art, cuisine, leisure, pleasure. And I know those are stereotypes and there's exceptions, but the reason they're stereotypes is because it's generally true. Onward. Malinowski, M-A-L-I-N-O-W-S-K-I, Malinowski, believed the main purpose of culture was to serve the biological and psychological needs of its members. He didn't believe we had any inborn instincts, so he's kind of following the John Locke tabula rasa blank slate model, not the Noam Chomsky universal grammar model. But no inborn instincts. All survival skills must be taught or learned. Tools we use to meet needs directly, but we use things like religion to meet needs indirectly. So religion deals with like psychological, emotional, moral needs, but tools like hammers, shovels, saws, knives, forks deal with physiological needs directly. Structural functionalism. So this is a variation of functionalism. It looks at what maintains the structure of a group. And here we see the first seeds of critical race theory. So this is the question critical race theorists are asking. It's like, what is holding the group together? Is it an ideology? Is it a belief? Is it fear? Is it a common goal? Is it a common culture? Is it a common religion? What is it that's holding the group together? And we could take our school as an example, as a subgroup. You could say what's holding our school together is the mission statement. That is like the hub or the core that all the disciplines, all the majors, all the faculty and staff and students should be orbiting around, this core central idea that we believe in a God, we believe he's revealed his will through his scriptures, we believe he's reconciled us with his son, and then everything else radiates out of that Christian or theistic worldview. But that is what is the structure holding us together. For other people, it may be profits, or it may be in advancements in technology. It might be in service. There's lots of different things that could hold a group together. Radcliffe Brown links society to a biological organism. And he saw each member of society as an interdependent part of the whole. And this is Radcliffe Brown. And when I was reading this part in the book, I couldn't help but think of the Apostle Paul and how he described the church, how we're one body with many members. Well, that's how Radcliffe Brown saw society or culture. We're one culture or one society, but there's many members with many different functions. Some we see as noble and beautiful and we put on display, others not so much, you know, kind of the messy bits or parts that we kind of like to keep behind closed doors or keep under wraps. But all of them are essential and necessary for the functioning of the body or organism, in this case, society. Questions, comments? Okay. Equilibrium. Equilibrium, I love this word, is considered to be the normal state of society. And so Radcliffe Brown and others believed we use social techniques and controls to preserve equilibrium in our society. Like right now, you can see America is out of balance, right? And we have tensions pulling us on the left and the right. And both of these groups believe we're out of balance for different reasons. And they're trying to pull the bulk of us who are somewhere in the middle to either the left or the right, depending on their perception and worldview. And there's lots of different ways we can try to bring equilibrium to society or to our group. Here's a couple ways. One way is through avoidance. When people aren't acting within the range of normalcy, we'll often avoid or ostracize them. Back to Paul's analogy, right? That's how he believed you needed to deal with church discipline. If someone isn't being a healthy, productive member of the body of Christ, if they're in sin, they need to be disfellowshipped. They need to be cut off. You're not even supposed to eat a meal with those people. And that is a technique to try to bring someone in conformity or back into equilibrium with the group. If someone isn't practicing proper hygiene, people are probably going to scoot away from them at the lunchroom table or in the classroom or in the van. And that's an avoidance technique, which is communicating you are not conforming to the norms of our group, and you need to do so. It could be because of their theological beliefs, because of their political views, because of their sports teams. There's all sorts of things we could do to try to bring people in. Another technique is joking, and I find this crazy fascinating. We often will use jokes or humor in an attempt to shame or manipulate people into changing their behavior. So maybe you went and got some edgy haircut and you come off and you want to test it out with your friends, and people start joking like, whoa, did you get in a fight with the lawnmower or something like that? Well, they're saying it as a joke, but what they're conveying to you and to the group is you are out of bounds, you are not following the norms and the protocols, and we are going to mock you and make fun of you until you look like the rest of us again. Does that make sense? I mean, I call people on this all the time. It usually happens when you're with 3 or more people. I don't normally see this one-on-one, but definitely when you get into groups of 3 or more, what will happen is someone will get picked on, and it will usually be in jest or in a joking way. And then when people do that to me, when people use public humor to confront you or to comment on your appearance or your beliefs or your values, it's actually one of these equilibrium techniques using humor to try to force you back into conformity. So when people do that to me, I publicly call them on it, and I ask them, why are you attacking me? Why are you trying to make me conform to your views and your values? Why are you judging me? And it's quite fun because people will usually backtrack really quickly, deny what they're doing, but watch for it next time. When you're out with a group of friends or something, how people will use humor in an attempt to manipulate social norms. Does anyone have an example from your own life where that's happened to you, or you've done that to someone else? Now, granted, I would rather have someone use humor to correct me than to a stern, mean, authoritarian voice. I think there's a place for a light humor, chiding correction, but you can tell when it kind of turns, right? And they think what they can do is say, oh, dude, I was just joking. I was just joking around. Take it easy. But see, they're not just joking around. When you make a public joke at someone else's expense, you are trying to point out that they have apparent behavior or thinking. They are not part of the group.
Yeah, I can agree with that as well. When it comes to, well, I'm an aviation student, and
Yep.
so most of my family, they see it as maybe a little crazy, especially before I even wanted to be a pilot. I used to skydive, and
Holy cow.
most people look at me like, you know, why would you jump out of a perfectly good airplane? And it's like, well, I mean, because it's fun. But yeah, that I can see how that would be. They're trying to get me not to do something.
Right. And one of the ways to do that, I mean, people could argue with you rationally, logically, or they could use humor or joke with you that you're missing a chip or you got a screw loose or something's not all there to make you want to do that kind of risky behavior. And that is part of others trying to get us to conform to what they think we should look like, act like, think like. And just be aware of that. There's a lot of pressure if you want to run outside the group. Okay? Conformity is a virtue in most cultures and society. Those who refuse to... Go ahead, Kendall.
Oh, yeah. So would the only, like, reason or somebody would do that would be, like, to get them to be down on their level again? Something like that?
Right, but they are probably considering it get them back up to their level. Like, you slipped, you've fallen out of the norm, you need to get your act together. All of us still look right and think right. You're the one who's left
be,
the...
feeling a little jealous as well. Like, as if, like, for some cases, they might feel like they wish they could do something like that, or like they want to be just like you, but they're trying to make you feel bad because they don't have the courage to do what you're doing.
Right. Let me give you a couple examples. Say you're with a group of people that look like me. You got kind of longish hair, long beard, kind of the let it be look. And then the next thing you know, one of your buddies, your mountain man buddies comes and he's got a high and tight cut. He has a really well-trimmed, groomed beard. You can tell he's used maybe a little man cover to fix any little blemishes and all of that. And he's wearing like a three-piece suit and tie. Well, that would be really shocking to me. And I could see myself saying stuff like, way to sell out to the man, or who are you trying to impress, or did you become a Republican or something? And I could say these things jokingly, but you see there's like this deeper dig at, you're not doing it right. You've turned your back on the group. You've betrayed us. Something a little lighter, when I see people, like I saw a few of the faculty and staff after summer, and they had grown beards. And so I did it in a more positive humor way because I wanted to reinforce what I saw as good behavior, beard growing for men. And so every time I saw one of the faculty or staff who had grown a new beard, I would say, oh, I'm so glad you got right with Jesus this summer. And the implication being those with beards were right with Jesus and those without are not, which is obvious, foolish nonsense. One's beard or lack thereof has nothing to do with their relationship with Jesus. But that's using like humor as a technique to try to push behavior in the direction I think it should go. And we will use that as a society. I mean, think of it. You were probably publicly humiliated in elementary school by a teacher if you came to school looking or smelling funny. I mean, maybe you had a nice teacher and they pulled you aside and talked to you privately, quietly, but especially in middle school, man, it was brutal, where both your peers and your parents and your schools are all trying to force you into this type of conformity and identity. And as middle schoolers, you guys are much closer to that time than me, but I remember how overwhelming it was, and realizing what a little sense of self I had, and trying to figure out who I was and what I believed and where I belonged, where I fit in. And so it's a rough time. And a lot of these groups are using these avoidance and humor techniques to bring conformity. And with that, we are out of time. So we will start with general evolution on Monday. Okay.